It started like any ordinary day in Los Angeles, but by the time the sun had set, the world would be reeling from a shock that no one could have predicted. Rob Reiner, the legendary actor and director whose films have shaped generations, and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner, a beloved figure in their community, were dead. The person responsible? Their own son, Nick Reiner, a 32-year-old man whose life until now had largely stayed out of the headlines. But in a tragic twist of fate, he had become the center of a story that would dominate news cycles, spark social media frenzy, and leave a Hollywood family fractured beyond repair. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine walking into your home and seeing the people who raised you, the people who had guided and loved you, suddenly taken from the world. Now imagine that the person who did it is standing not far from you in court, in shackles, wearing a suicide prevention smock, staring back at you with a blank, unreadable expression. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the real-life nightmare unfolding in Los Angeles, and the details are stranger than fiction. The first reports were chilling. Los Angeles County District Attorney Nathan Hochman announced in a press conference that Nick Reiner had been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, including a special circumstance of multiple murders and an allegation that he personally used a deadly weapon, a knife. The potential consequences are as dire as they are chilling. Nick faces life in prison, possibly the death penalty, and for the public watching, it was impossible not to be drawn into the spiraling drama. But what drove Nick Reiner to this unimaginable act? Was it a long-simmering tension in a celebrity household? Was it a sudden mental breakdown? Or was it something else entirely, something hidden beneath the surface of this family's seemingly perfect life? These are the questions that keep experts, journalists, and the public on edge, as each new revelation adds a layer of complexity to a story that seems almost too dark to believe. Nick's courtroom appearances have already become headline news. Video footage shows him struggling in his restraints, visibly agitated, and at one point, beginning to fight within the courtroom itself. The image of a son turning on his parents, then displaying such volatility under the scrutiny of the legal system, is both terrifying and compelling. It raises questions about mental health, legal preparedness, and the ways in which the justice system handles cases that are as emotionally charged as they are criminally serious. At the center of this unfolding tragedy is a man who grew up in the shadow of fame. Rob Reiner, 78, has long been celebrated for his work in Hollywood. From his early acting days to his iconic directorial efforts, he carved out a name that is synonymous with talent, wit, and cultural influence. Michelle Singer Reiner, while perhaps less well-known to the public, was a beloved partner, mother, and community figure, her life characterized by philanthropy and dedication to those around her. Their deaths are not just the loss of 2 individuals. They are a rupture in a world that had looked at the Reiners as an emblem of success, stability, and family values. Yet for all the admiration and respect that surrounded Rob and Michelle, no one outside the family fully understood the pressures and dynamics inside their household. Celebrity families are often glamorized in the public eye, yet beneath the surface, they may struggle with expectations, personal conflicts, and the intense scrutiny that comes with fame. Nick Reiner's life, until recently, was largely private. He was known to some circles, but not infamous. Certainly not for the kind of violent act that would send shockwaves through Los Angeles and across the nation. As the news broke, social media erupted with speculation. Tweets, posts, and videos flooded the internet, each one trying to piece together a puzzle that few could fully comprehend. Some sympathized with Nick, questioning his mental state and possible struggles with depression or other disorders. Others expressed disbelief, anger, and even a sense of betrayal. How could a son do this to his own parents? How could someone raised in love, comfort, and privilege reach a point where murder seemed possible? The reactions were polarized, emotional, and raw, a reflection of the deep shock that gripped everyone following the case. Legal experts immediately began analyzing the case. 2 counts of first-degree murder carry severe penalties, and the added circumstances of multiple murders and the use of a deadly weapon increased the stakes dramatically. Nick Reiner's defense team, led by attorney Alan Jackson, has urged the public not to rush to judgment, highlighting the complexity of the case and the need for due process. But even as legal strategies are being mapped out, the images of Nick in the courtroom, restraints, smock, and visible agitation, have become the defining visual of this tragedy, a symbol of a story that is at once horrifying, fascinating, and incomprehensible. The murder charges alone are enough to dominate headlines, but the courtroom fight adds another layer of sensationalism. Footage and reports suggest that Nick did not remain passive during proceedings. There was resistance, agitation, and outbursts that captured the attention of everyone present. It is a scene that challenges our understanding of human behavior. The son who allegedly killed his parents now struggling visibly, almost theatrically, in court. The legal implications are enormous, but the human dimension, the questions about why this happened and what led to such a breakdown, captures the imagination in a way that legal briefs and formal statements cannot. In exploring this story, one cannot ignore the cultural resonance. Hollywood is a world obsessed with image, legacy, and perception. The Reiner family has long embodied a certain ideal, talent combined with a stable, loving family life. That ideal has been shattered, leaving behind a narrative that is as much about human frailty and tragedy as it is about crime. The public fascination is understandable. We are drawn to stories of extremes, love and loss, fame and infamy, innocence and betrayal. And in Nick Reiner's story, all of these extremes collide in a way that is impossible to ignore. There are so many unanswered questions. What was the state of Nick's mental health leading up to the murders? Were there warning signs that went unnoticed? How did Rob and Michelle perceive their youngest son? And were there tensions or conflicts hidden from public view? Each of these questions invites speculation, but the full truth remains obscured, locked within the courtroom and the minds of those involved. As investigators and journalists dig deeper, each revelation seems to raise as many questions as it answers, creating a tension that is gripping, almost unbearable, for those following the story closely. What makes this case even more compelling and tragic is the contrast between the public perception of the family and the private reality. To the outside world, the Reiners were emblematic of success and stability. Rob Reiner had a long, celebrated career. Michelle Singer Reiner was admired in her own right. But behind closed doors, the family was grappling with issues that the public could not see. Nick Reiner's actions, shocking as they are, force a confrontation with the idea that even the most seemingly perfect families can harbor unimaginable darkness. And yet, even in the midst of this horror, there is a human story that cannot be ignored. The grief of surviving family members, the heartbreak of friends, and the questions haunting the public all create a complex emotional landscape. How does one reconcile admiration for Rob Reiner's contributions to film with the knowledge that his life ended in such a violent, tragic manner? How does the public process the simultaneous fascination with and horror at Nick's actions? These questions form the emotional core of the story and set the stage for the detailed exploration that will follow in the chapters ahead. The introduction is meant not only to grab attention, but also to prepare viewers for a narrative that will unfold in stages, revealing shocking facts, emotional truths, and legal intricacies. As we move forward, each chapter will examine different facets of the story. Nick Reiner's background, the dynamics of the Reiner household, the crime scene, the investigation, the courtroom battles, and the public and media response. Each section will build suspense, offer insights, and leave viewers with cliffhangers that propel them into the next chapter. The story of Nick Reiner and the murders of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner is far from over. Every court appearance, every new piece of evidence, and every expert analysis adds depth to a narrative that is already both horrifying and captivating. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, fame, mental health, and human behavior. And it begins here, in the first moments of public revelation, where the shock, the grief, and the disbelief were palpable. But what truly pushed Nick Reiner to this point? What unseen pressures or events led to a son turning against his own parents? And how will the courtroom drama play out as the legal system seeks to untangle this web of tragedy, anger, and confusion? These questions will guide us through a story that is as emotionally charged as it is legally complex. It was a morning like any other in Los Angeles, or so it seemed. The sun rose over the sprawling city, casting its golden light over palm trees, quiet streets, and the homes of the rich and famous. But inside one elegant Beverly Hills residence, the unthinkable had already occurred. By the time neighbors would hear sirens and reporters would flood the scene, Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, two pillars of their community and Hollywood icons, had been brutally taken from the world. The discovery was a shock not just to friends and family, but to an entire city, and soon, to the world. The first whispers of the tragedy came from neighbors who noticed an unusual stillness around the Reiner household. A normally bustling driveway was quiet. Doors that were usually open, the sign of a welcoming home, were locked. And then, a call to law enforcement changed everything. Police officers arrived to a scene that would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Inside the home, they found evidence of a violent struggle, and, most disturbingly, they discovered that the perpetrator was not a stranger. It was the son of the victims, Nick Reiner, a man known to some as private, largely invisible in public life, now thrust into infamy. Detectives quickly secured the scene, but the initial investigation left more questions than answers. How did a son, raised in comfort and apparent love, come to commit such an act? Were there signs of premeditation, or was this the result of a sudden breakdown? Neighbors and friends were left stunned. The Reiners had long been seen as a family of achievement, respect, and normalcy in an otherwise tumultuous Hollywood landscape. Rob Reiner, at 78, had crafted a legendary career, and Michelle Singer Reiner had earned admiration for her philanthropy and dedication to family. To imagine their lives ending at the hands of their own child was almost impossible. As news broke, the public's reaction was instantaneous. Social media exploded with speculation, grief, and disbelief. Hashtags trended, tweets poured in, and YouTube channels began analyzing every detail available from police statements and media reports. Some tried to find motive. Others tried to contextualize the tragedy with discussions about mental health, the pressures of fame, and family dynamics. The story gripped the nation, in part because of the shocking nature of the crime, and in part because of the human element. A son turning against his own parents in a way that defies comprehension. Police confirmed that Nick Reiner had been arrested without incident, but he appeared visibly disturbed and agitated, foreshadowing what would later unfold in the courtroom. He was immediately held without bail, and the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office announced he would face charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including multiple murders and the use of a deadly weapon. The gravity of these charges cannot be overstated. First-degree murder in California carries life imprisonment or even the death penalty, and the added circumstances suggest the prosecution viewed the crime as particularly heinous and premeditated. Neighbors and friends began to share memories of the Reiners that painted a stark contrast to the horror of the crime. Some remembered Rob Reiner's humor and warmth, recounting stories from film sets or casual interactions at charity events. Michelle Singer Reiner was recalled as kind, thoughtful, and deeply committed to her family and community. These recollections created a haunting juxtaposition against the reality of their deaths. How could such vibrant, loving lives be ended in such a violent and incomprehensible way? The immediate aftermath of the discovery was chaotic. Police and emergency responders cordoned off the neighborhood, and the media converged on the scene in droves. Helicopters hovered overhead, capturing footage of the sprawling estate, while journalists speculated on motives and details that had not yet been confirmed. It was a scene that mirrored the intensity of a Hollywood movie. Fitting, perhaps, given Rob Reiner's career, but it was horrifyingly real. For investigators, the day was consumed with piecing together the timeline. When did the crime occur? Was there a confrontation beforehand? Were there any calls or warnings that might have foreshadowed the tragedy? As they scoured the home for evidence, they discovered items that hinted at a struggle, as well as indications that Nick Reiner had prepared for his arrest, or, at the very least, understood the severity of what he had done. The presence of a deadly weapon added a further layer of gravity. The news conference held by District Attorney Nathan Hochman marked the first official public acknowledgement of the crime. Hochman's voice, steady yet somber, conveyed the seriousness of the situation. He confirmed the charges, described the special circumstances, and highlighted the potential consequences. Yet, even in this formal, factual presentation, the tragedy and shock were palpable. Hochman warned the public that this case would be closely watched, not only because of the celebrity involved, but because of the shocking nature of the crime itself. Even as legal proceedings began to take shape, the human cost of the tragedy was clear. Friends and family were left to process grief in public view, while the media scrutinized every detail. Interviews with neighbors revealed a mix of disbelief and sorrow, with many describing the Reiners as a model family. Some admitted that they had noticed small signs of tension between Nick and his parents, but nothing that could have predicted this level of violence. This tension between public perception and private reality created a narrative that would dominate the media for weeks, if not months. As the day progressed, Nick Reiner's past began to receive scrutiny. Investigators, journalists, and the public began to explore his upbringing, relationships with his parents, and any history that might explain the act. Questions arose. Was there mental instability? Were there conflicts over inheritance or personal grievances? Could pressure or resentment have accumulated unnoticed until it erupted into violence? Each question added a layer of complexity, keeping the public engaged and eager for answers. The shock extended beyond Hollywood. National media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about family dynamics, mental health, and the potential darkness lurking behind even seemingly perfect households. The story dominated evening news cycles, morning shows, and online platforms. It was a rare convergence of celebrity, crime, and emotional resonance that ensured the public would be watching every development closely. Despite the attention, the facts were grim. Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner were dead, and their son was charged with taking their lives. Nick Reiner's actions had created a ripple effect, legal ramifications, media frenzy, social media speculation, and a profound emotional impact on everyone who knew the family. It was a tragedy with layers that no single explanation could fully encompass. By evening, Los Angeles was abuzz with discussions of what had happened. Experts appeared on television to dissect the possible motives. Legal analysts debated the charges, and psychologists weighed in on potential mental health issues. The courtroom, although not yet in session, was already a focal point, as viewers imagined the drama that would unfold when Nick Reiner faced the judge and the public. In the midst of this whirlwind, one fact remained unassailable. The Reiners were gone, and the world would never see them again. Their deaths were not just a loss to family and friends, but to the cultural fabric that Rob Reiner had helped shape through decades of filmmaking. And as the story unfolded, one question loomed larger than any other. Why? Why would a son commit the unthinkable and take the lives of the very people who had given him everything? The day's revelations were just the beginning. Investigators were already uncovering new details, neighbors were offering insight into family dynamics, and the public was consuming every morsel of information with a mix of horror and fascination. The scene was set for a courtroom drama unlike any other, a legal and emotional battle that would reveal shocking truths about family, mental health, and the consequences of unchecked tensions. Nick Reiner, 32, the youngest son of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, had always lived a life under the shadow of Hollywood fame, but until now, his name was seldom spoken in the headlines. He was the quiet one, the son who preferred to stay out of the public eye while his parents' achievements dominated every news cycle. Rob Reiner, a legendary actor, director, and producer, was a household name. Michelle Singer Reiner, though less known in mainstream media, had carved out her own niche as a beloved figure in philanthropy and community initiatives. Together, they were the perfect Hollywood power couple. And Nick? He was the one left behind, largely invisible, until tragedy thrust him into the center of a national nightmare. From a young age, Nick's life was a mix of privilege and pressure. Growing up in a household where excellence was expected, surrounded by wealth and celebrity, could be intoxicating, but it also brought intense scrutiny and unspoken expectations. Friends from childhood recall a boy who was thoughtful, at times quiet and observant, but also increasingly withdrawn as he moved through adolescence. There were moments when he seemed bright, even brilliant, with flashes of wit that mirrored his father's humor. But there were also moments that hinted at inner struggles, emotional turbulence that went largely unnoticed by the public eye. School was a challenge for Nick in ways that were invisible to outsiders. While he had access to the best institutions, there were reports that he struggled socially, often finding it difficult to connect with peers. Some teachers described him as reserved or introspective, yet others sensed a simmering intensity beneath his calm exterior. These early behavioral cues were subtle. Nick's relationship with his parents was complicated, like that of many children, but amplified by the weight of fame. Rob Reiner, the father, was known to be demanding but loving. He had a clear vision for life, success, and personal integrity, standards he expected from everyone around him, including his children. Michelle Singer Reiner, the mother, was nurturing, empathetic, and fiercely protective. Together, they created a household of rules, routines, and expectations that many outsiders would envy. But within that household, Nick reportedly felt pressure to live up to an ideal that may have felt unattainable. As he moved into adulthood, Nick's struggles began to manifest in ways that worried those closest to him. While he avoided the limelight, he did have periods of erratic behavior, including volatile arguments with family members and moments of isolation. Mental health experts observing the case have suggested that underlying conditions, perhaps untreated or unnoticed, could have contributed to his actions. Some neighbors hinted at episodes of mood swings, while a few family friends described him as troubled but capable of affection. This duality, charm and volatility, would become central to understanding Nick Reiner's actions and mindset. Despite these struggles, Nick Reiner had moments of promise. He pursued education and hobbies that suggested intelligence and creativity, echoing his father's artistic inclinations. But there were gaps and inconsistencies, periods of employment that ended abruptly, friendships that appeared strained, and interests that shifted quickly. These inconsistencies puzzled observers and fueled speculation. Was Nick simply struggling to find his place in the world, or was there a deeper instability at play? Friends and acquaintances who knew Nick in adulthood describe a man whose internal life was turbulent. He could be engaging and insightful, yet withdrawn and volatile in the same conversation. He carried the weight of public scrutiny indirectly, aware that the Reiner name meant that his actions could attract attention, yet seemingly unable to navigate that pressure in a healthy way. Mental health professionals often note that individuals in high-pressure, high-visibility families can experience a unique form of stress, combining private anxieties with the awareness of public perception. Nick Reiner's life appeared to be a textbook example of this phenomenon. There were also signs of estrangement and conflict within the family. While details are emerging slowly, reports suggest that Nick had disagreements with his parents over lifestyle choices, personal relationships, and possibly financial matters. Some insiders hint at arguments that escalated into heated confrontations, though none could have predicted the scale of the eventual tragedy. These dynamics, when combined with potential mental health issues, paint a picture of a young man who may have felt increasingly alienated within the very family that was supposed to nurture him. One of the most haunting aspects of Nick's life is the contrast between public perception and private reality. To the outside world, the Reiners were a model family, successful, accomplished, and stable. Nick, as the youngest son, seemed to fit the image of a quiet, unassuming child. But behind closed doors, family dynamics were more complex. Sources suggest tension, occasional resentment, and possibly unaddressed emotional trauma. While no one outside the family could fully understand the depth of these struggles, the events that unfolded revealed just how fragile the facade of perfection can be. Nick's adult life also included periods of apparent normalcy. He maintained friendships, pursued interests, and had interactions with the wider Los Angeles community. But observers note that these periods were often punctuated by erratic behavior, outbursts, withdrawals, and sometimes cryptic comments that hinted at internal turmoil. These moments, though fleeting, suggest a man wrestling with forces that were invisible to the public and possibly even to those closest to him. As the case emerged, experts in psychology and criminology began analyzing Nick's profile. They point to several factors that often precede violent acts among adults, particularly in high-pressure households: unresolved emotional trauma, untreated mental illness, social isolation, and perceived familial rejection. While it is impossible to definitively diagnose from a distance, the behaviors described by acquaintances and reported by law enforcement align with some of these warning signs. Yet none of this fully explains why a son would allegedly turn violent toward his own parents, emphasizing the complexity and tragedy of the situation. In examining Nick Reiner's life, one cannot ignore the shadow of celebrity that loomed over him. Growing up as the son of Rob Reiner meant constant comparisons, whether in intelligence, charisma, or achievement. The pressure to succeed, to meet the expectations of a world that idealized his father, may have created internal conflicts that worsened over time. This pressure, combined with any underlying psychological issues, created a perfect storm, an emotional tension that ultimately erupted in the most horrifying way possible. Neighbors and family friends often recall Nick as polite yet distant, capable of warmth but prone to withdrawing for long periods. Some observed him spending hours alone, absorbed in thought, while others noticed sudden bursts of agitation or frustration. These inconsistencies puzzled those who tried to understand him, and they contributed to a growing sense of unease among those who saw glimpses of his private life. In retrospect, these were warning signs, but like many warning signs, they were subtle and easily dismissed until it was too late. Even now, as court proceedings unfold, Nick's past continues to be scrutinized. Every school report, every childhood anecdote, every account of interpersonal conflicts is dissected to understand the man who allegedly committed an unthinkable act. Psychologists, journalists, and the public alike are attempting to reconcile the image of a son raised in privilege with the reality of a man accused of murder. The dissonance is striking, and it fuels both fascination and horror. Yet despite all the speculation, one fact remains clear. Nick Reiner is at the center of a tragedy that has already claimed 2 lives, disrupted a family, and captivated a nation. Understanding him, his upbringing, his relationships, his struggles, is essential to understanding the broader story. Without this context, the crime risks being reduced to sensational headlines, stripping away the human complexity that makes it both compelling and devastating. And as the investigation continues, the public is left with more questions than answers. Was Nick Reiner a deeply troubled man whose internal struggles finally manifested in violence? Or was there a tipping point, a series of events and pressures that pushed him beyond the brink? The answers remain elusive, and each new detail only deepens the mystery. The story of Nick Reiner is not just the story of a son accused of murdering his parents. It is a story about family, fame, mental health, and the pressures that can exist behind closed doors. It challenges our assumptions about privilege, success, and human behavior, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of even the most seemingly perfect households. We will focus on Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner themselves, the lives they built, the legacy they left behind, and the shocking end that befell them. Understanding their story is crucial to understanding why Nick's actions resonate so profoundly with the public, and how a family that seemed so stable could be shattered in an instant. Rob Reiner was more than a name in Hollywood. He was a living legend, a man whose work had defined generations. From his early acting days as Michael Stivic on All in the Family to his iconic directorial achievements with This Is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, and When Harry Met Sally. Reiner had a career marked by creativity, wit, and cultural resonance. He wasn't just successful, he was beloved, admired for his intelligence, humor, and apparent decency. Michelle Singer Reiner, though less visible in the public eye, was no less remarkable. She had dedicated herself to philanthropy, championing causes that ranged from education to social justice, and was deeply involved in the community. Together, they embodied what many considered the ideal partnership, a union of talent, influence, and unwavering support for one another. Their lives, however, ended abruptly and violently, in a tragedy that has stunned Hollywood and the world. To comprehend the magnitude of their loss, it's essential to understand who they were as individuals and as a couple, and why their deaths resonate so profoundly. Rob Reiner was the quintessential Hollywood intellectual, a director who could tackle comedy, drama, and social commentary with equal skill. Colleagues remember him as meticulous on set, yet endlessly generous with younger actors and crew members. He had the rare ability to balance professionalism with warmth, leaving a legacy of respect that extended far beyond the films themselves. Michelle Singer Reiner, on the other hand, was the quiet force behind many of Rob's public and private successes. Friends describe her as compassionate, fiercely intelligent, and protective of her family. She maintained a presence in philanthropic circles, often working behind the scenes to ensure her initiatives had meaningful impact. While Rob received much of the public acclaim, Michelle's influence in shaping family life and supporting community endeavors was immense. Together, they created a household that, from the outside, appeared harmonious, successful, and grounded. Yet for all their accomplishments, the Reiners were not immune to the complexities of family life. Behind closed doors, like many households, there were tensions, disagreements, and unspoken pressures. Balancing careers in the public eye, the expectations of celebrity, and the needs of children is rarely simple, and in the Reiner household, these challenges were magnified by fame. Nick, their youngest son, had always been more reserved, more introspective, and perhaps more sensitive to family dynamics than his parents, or the public, realized. On the day of their deaths, the loss of Rob and Michelle was felt not just by immediate family, but by countless colleagues, friends, and fans. Rob's contributions to film had touched millions, shaping the cultural landscape, while Michelle's quiet philanthropy had improved countless lives in ways that were often unseen but deeply impactful. Their deaths left a vacuum, a sudden absence that was felt immediately by all who knew them and those who admired their work from afar. The circumstances surrounding their deaths added layers of shock and horror. It wasn't just the fact that they had been murdered, it was who had allegedly done it. Their own son, Nick, stood accused. The news defied logic and understanding, and it forced a confrontation with questions no one was prepared to answer. How could a son, raised in love and comfort, turn against the very people who had nurtured him? What forces, psychological, social, or familial, could lead to such a devastating act? Friends and colleagues recall Rob and Michelle not only as professionals, but as people who valued relationships, loyalty, and honesty. Rob had a reputation for mentorship, helping young directors and actors navigate the often treacherous waters of Hollywood. Michelle's circle remembered her as someone who could calm conflicts, mediate disputes, and bring perspective when tensions rose. In many ways, they were the stabilizing force in their family and community. A couple whose influence extended far beyond the walls of their home. Yet even in households that seem ideal, underlying tensions can exist. Those closest to the Reiners hinted at moments of disagreement with Nick, arguments that may have seemed minor at the time, but could have sown seeds of resentment. Reports suggest that Nick may have struggled with feelings of inadequacy or frustration, emotions that, if left unchecked, can fester and escalate. These human complexities remind us that even the most accomplished and loving families are not immune to tragedy. In the immediate aftermath, reactions from the public were a mix of grief, disbelief, and fascination. Fans of Rob Reiner's films expressed sorrow on social media, sharing memories of how his work had impacted their lives. Admirers of Michelle Singer Reiner's philanthropy highlighted the tangible difference she had made in the community. Yet alongside the mourning was a pervasive question: how did this happen? The juxtaposition of their celebrated lives and violent deaths created a narrative that was both compelling and incomprehensible. The investigation into their deaths painted a grim picture. Detectives worked tirelessly to reconstruct the timeline, gather evidence, and understand the dynamics that led to the murders. Every corner of the home was examined for clues, every interaction scrutinized. The discovery of a deadly weapon added to the gravity of the situation, confirming that this was not an accident or a moment of spontaneous anger. It was a violent act with life-altering consequences. Family members were left grappling with shock and grief, trying to reconcile their memories of Rob and Michelle with the reality of their loss. The emotional toll was immense, compounded by the public nature of the case. In interviews, relatives struggled to articulate their feelings, often alternating between disbelief, sorrow, and anger. It became clear that the Reiners' lives, though publicly admired, were intimately entwined with complex family dynamics that no one outside the household could fully understand. The deaths of Rob and Michelle also forced a broader cultural reckoning. Hollywood, which often glorifies celebrity families, was confronted with the stark reality that wealth, fame, and success do not inoculate against tragedy. Discussions emerged about mental health, family pressures, and the hidden challenges faced by children growing up in high-profile households. Nick Reiner's actions were horrifying, but they also served as a lens through which society could examine the unseen difficulties behind even the most glamorous facades. As the day unfolded, investigators, journalists, and the public were drawn deeper into the story. Every revelation seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Were there signs of Nick's instability that had gone unnoticed? Could interventions have prevented this? And, perhaps most chillingly, was there something in the Reiner family's past, an unresolved conflict, a secret tension, that had set the stage for this tragedy? Rob Reiner's colleagues in the film industry expressed profound shock. Directors, actors, and producers who had worked with him shared memories that highlighted his warmth, creativity, and commitment to storytelling. Michelle Singer Reiner's friends and associates spoke of her kindness, intelligence, and tireless efforts to improve the lives of others. These personal recollections made the violence of their deaths all the more jarring, underscoring the stark contrast between their public personas and the horror of the events that claimed their lives. The story, though deeply personal, quickly became a public obsession. Media outlets dissected every detail, social media platforms buzzed with speculation, and the world collectively tried to make sense of a crime that defied understanding. For many, the tragedy was not just about the murder itself, but about the vulnerability of even the most seemingly perfect families. Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner's deaths were a brutal reminder that love, success, and admiration cannot shield anyone from the unpredictability of human behavior. And yet, as shocking as the murders were, the story was far from over. The investigation was just beginning. The legal proceedings were about to unfold, and the public had only glimpsed the first layer of a complex and disturbing narrative. Questions about motive, mental health, and family dynamics would dominate headlines in the weeks and months to come, keeping the tragedy in the public consciousness and ensuring that the story of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner's untimely deaths would not be forgotten. The crime scene at the Reiner household was one that would linger in the minds of investigators, reporters, and eventually the public. As police entered the sprawling Beverly Hills estate, they were met with a scene that was both meticulously detailed and horrifyingly chaotic, a juxtaposition that would come to define much of the public's understanding of the tragedy. The meticulous nature of the investigation was a stark reminder that even in the midst of violence, law enforcement was tasked with uncovering truth, piecing together clues, and reconstructing the moments leading up to a horrific act. Detectives noted the initial signs of struggle immediately. Furniture had been displaced, a few objects showed signs of being used defensively, and there were indications that the confrontation had not been entirely one-sided. Yet what stood out most was the shocking realization that the suspect, Nick Reiner, had been inside the home during the attack. The idea that a son could commit such violence against his parents was almost incomprehensible, and yet the evidence made it undeniable. Officers began meticulously documenting the scene, photographing, collecting, and cataloging every potential piece of evidence with a precision born of years of experience. Among the most significant pieces of evidence was the weapon itself, a knife reportedly used in the attack. Its presence immediately elevated the severity of the crime. In cases of first-degree murder, the use of a deadly weapon is a key factor in establishing intent and premeditation. Prosecutors later confirmed that the weapon would be central to the charges, particularly the allegations that Nick Reiner had personally wielded it. Law enforcement knew that understanding the weapon's role, how it was obtained, and how it was used could shed light on Nick's state of mind and the sequence of events that led to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner. The investigation also focused heavily on the timeline of events. Police needed to determine exactly when the murders occurred, how long Nick had been inside the house, and whether any interactions with the victims had preceded the attack. Digital evidence, including phone records, surveillance footage, and electronic communications, became critical to piecing together the moments leading up to the tragedy. Every message, every phone call, and every movement was scrutinized to form a comprehensive picture of what had happened. Law enforcement officers also paid close attention to the physical layout of the home. The Reiner estate was not only a family residence, but also a place that had hosted countless gatherings, meetings, and social events over the years. Investigators mapped every room, entryway, and potential escape route to determine how the events unfolded. This meticulous attention to detail would later play a critical role in both the prosecution's and the defense's narratives, as each side sought to interpret the evidence to support their version of events. Witness statements were another key component of the investigation. Neighbors reported hearing unusual noises in the hours leading up to the discovery, including what they described as loud thuds or muffled sounds. While initially dismissed by some as routine household activity, the forensic team worked tirelessly to gather DNA, fingerprints, and other physical evidence that could definitively connect Nick Reiner to the crime. Each sample was analyzed, cataloged, and cross-referenced with known items and locations within the home. Investigators also examined the victims' bodies for any defensive wounds or signs of struggle, which could provide insight into how the events unfolded. While the physical evidence painted a grim picture, it also offered a foundation for understanding the sequence of actions that led to the murders, a foundation that would become critical during courtroom proceedings. Mental health professionals were also consulted as part of the investigation. Nick Reiner's visible agitation, prior history of erratic behavior, and the fact that he had been seen in a suicide prevention smock at court indicated potential underlying psychological issues. Experts analyzed his behavior for signs of premeditation, impulse control, and cognitive functioning, offering assessments that would later influence both the prosecution and defense strategies. Their evaluations raised additional questions. Had there been missed warning signs? Could interventions have prevented the tragedy? And what role, if any, did untreated mental health issues play in the crime? The involvement of the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office further amplified the seriousness of the investigation. DA Nathan Hochman, in his first public statements, highlighted not only the charges, but also the complexity of the case. The inclusion of special circumstances, multiple murders, and the use of a deadly weapon signaled that the prosecution viewed the crime as especially egregious. The announcement set the stage for a legal battle that would dominate headlines and keep the public riveted. Media coverage of the crime scene added another layer of intensity. Photographers and journalists swarmed the neighborhood, capturing images of police vehicles, crime tape, and investigators moving through the property. Social media amplified these visuals, with videos and photos circulating rapidly, creating a constant stream of updates and speculation. The public's fascination was fueled by a mix of celebrity involvement, shocking violence, and the broader questions about family and mental health that the case raised. One particularly chilling element of the investigation involved the discovery of personal items belonging to the victims that seemed to indicate a struggle had occurred in multiple rooms. Investigators noted signs that Nick Reiner had moved through the house, engaging with the victims in different spaces, which suggested a chaotic and violent series of events. These observations would later be used by prosecutors to argue that the murders were not impulsive, but involved a level of deliberation and intent that justified first-degree murder charges. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement also had to consider the broader implications of a high-profile crime. The Reiners were not just any family. They were prominent figures whose deaths would attract national attention. Every step had to be documented meticulously to avoid procedural errors that could compromise the case. Officers worked under immense pressure, balancing the need for accuracy with the intense scrutiny from media and public observers. By the end of the first week, investigators had compiled an extensive file of evidence, witness statements, forensic analyses, and expert opinions. Each piece contributed to a narrative that, while tragic, also provided insight into the events of that fateful day. The crime scene, once a private domestic space, had been transformed into a repository of information that would be dissected in court, in news reports, and in public debates for months to come. Yet, even with all the evidence collected, crucial questions remained unanswered. What had driven Nick Reiner to commit such an unthinkable act? Was there a single tipping point, or was this the result of years of accumulated stress, resentment, or untreated mental illness? And as the investigation unfolded, would new evidence emerge that could shift the understanding of what had happened in those final hours? The crime scene and investigation provided the first glimpse into the reality of the tragedy, offering both clarity and confusion. While evidence confirmed Nick's involvement, the human motivations, emotional triggers, and psychological factors remained elusive, a reminder that even the most thorough investigations cannot fully capture the complexity of human behavior. The courtroom is supposed to be a place of order, a theater where justice is measured and deliberated in a controlled environment. But when Nick Reiner appeared for the first time in court, it quickly became clear that this would be anything but ordinary. Shackled and wearing a suicide prevention smock, Nick's presence was both shocking and surreal, a visual manifestation of a story that had already captivated the nation. Every eye in the courtroom, from the judge to the spectators in the gallery, was drawn to him, trying to read the emotions, or lack thereof, on a face that had become infamous almost overnight. The hearing began with the standard procedural formalities, but Nick's behavior quickly disrupted the expected rhythm. Court officers and bailiffs watched as he fidgeted, shouted, and at one point lunged toward the defense table in a fit of visible agitation. The initial shock of seeing him so unrestrained in his emotional state left many in the courtroom and watching on camera in disbelief. Legal analysts immediately began commenting on the severity of his outbursts, noting that they were rare even in high-profile cases. For most defendants, court appearances are tense but controlled. For Nick Reiner, the courtroom became a stage for a performance no one could predict. Observers described the scene as chaotic. Nick shouted at the judge, demanded explanations, and at moments refused to follow instructions. Bailiffs moved in repeatedly, attempting to maintain order, yet he continued to resist. The smock he wore, a measure intended to prevent self-harm, only added to the visual drama. It was a stark reminder of the intersecting issues in this case. A high-profile criminal trial, questions of mental health, and the extreme emotions inherent in a situation where a son faces accusations of murdering his own parents. Legal experts watching closely noted that Nick's courtroom behavior could significantly impact the proceedings. Judges and jurors are human, and seeing a defendant act violently or erratically can create bias, whether conscious or subconscious. At the same time, defense attorneys argued that his actions were a clear indication of mental instability, a factor that could be crucial in the months-long legal battle ahead. Alan Jackson, Nick's lawyer, made public statements urging the media and the public not to rush to judgment, emphasizing that courtroom outbursts are not necessarily reflective of guilt, but can stem from underlying psychological distress. The media, of course, seized on the spectacle. Video footage of Nick's behavior spread across social media, becoming a viral sensation almost immediately. News anchors replayed clips of his shouting, the physical struggle with bailiffs, and his wild gestures, creating a mix of horror and fascination for viewers. Commentators debated what it all meant. Was this the behavior of a guilty man, a desperate man, or a deeply troubled man caught in an unimaginable situation? Public opinion became polarized almost overnight, mirroring the emotional intensity of the courtroom itself. Beyond the spectacle, the outbursts raised serious questions about mental health. Psychologists analyzing Nick's behavior on live television suggested that his agitation, noncompliance, and intense emotional reactions could indicate a range of issues, from anxiety and depression to more severe disorders, such as psychosis or personality disorders. They noted that the combination of stress, isolation, and the weight of the charges against him created a perfect storm for emotional volatility. Every scream, every refusal to follow instructions, was seen not just as defiance, but as a window into a troubled mind struggling under extreme pressure. Witnesses in the courtroom described a tense atmosphere, with spectators whispering, gasping, and sometimes covering their eyes. Even seasoned court personnel were reportedly unnerved by the intensity of Nick's behavior. The chaos was amplified by the high stakes: 2 counts of first-degree murder, potential life imprisonment, or the death penalty. The courtroom was no longer merely a legal space. It had become a psychological battleground where every reaction, every word, and every movement was scrutinized in real time. The prosecutor, Nathan Hochman, remained composed despite the disruptions. He addressed the court calmly, emphasizing the seriousness of the charges and the evidence that had already been gathered. Hochman noted that the presence of multiple aggravating circumstances, including the use of a deadly weapon, made this case particularly severe. Yet even as he presented the legal facts, the public's attention remained riveted on Nick's unpredictable behavior. The courtroom chaos was not just background. It was central to the narrative, reinforcing the shocking reality that this was a family tragedy on a scale few could comprehend. Nick's lawyer, Alan Jackson, faced an extraordinary challenge. He had to balance the need to defend his client with the reality of the spectacle unfolding before the judge, jury, and the nation. Jackson argued that Nick's mental state should be a critical component of the case, pointing to his history of erratic behavior, previous emotional struggles, and the extreme stress of facing charges for murdering his parents. The defense suggested that his outbursts were symptomatic of deeper issues, not indicators of guilt or premeditation, a point that would become a central theme in the ongoing legal battle. In addition to the outbursts themselves, Nick's courtroom conduct sparked debates about security and safety. Bailiffs and court officers were forced to adopt heightened measures to prevent physical altercations, and discussions about mental health protocols in courtrooms became more urgent. Experts highlighted the tension between public access to justice and the need to protect all participants in high-stakes trials. Nick Reiner's case became a case study in how extreme emotional reactions intersect with legal procedure, raising questions that extended far beyond the individual tragedy. Social media response was immediate and overwhelming. Clips of Nick's behavior went viral on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, sparking discussion, memes, and debates about accountability, mental health, and family dynamics. The public was drawn into a story that felt simultaneously cinematic and horrifyingly real. Commentators, psychologists, and legal analysts dissected every gesture, tone of voice, and facial expression, attempting to read the inner workings of a mind that had, in the public eye, become both infamous and mysterious. The courtroom drama was compounded by media speculation about what might have led to the murders. Was it long-standing tension, untreated mental illness, or a sudden psychological break? Reports emerged suggesting that Nick had a history of interpersonal conflict, periods of isolation, and moments of intense emotional volatility. These details, combined with his behavior in court, painted a picture of a young man wrestling with forces that few could understand, let alone anticipate. Even within the court, the reactions of spectators and family members were intense. Family, friends, and relatives reportedly sat in stunned silence, some unable to watch, others trying to process the incomprehensible reality that a son accused of murdering his parents was now the center of a public spectacle. Emotional tension was palpable, with whispers, gasps, and occasional tears breaking the solemnity of the courtroom. The scene underscored the human cost of the crime. Not just the victims' deaths, but the profound impact on those left behind, forced to witness both the legal proceedings and Nick's erratic behavior. The significance of these outbursts extends beyond mere spectacle. They raised profound questions about the intersection of mental health and justice, the responsibilities of legal professionals, and the ethical dilemmas inherent in high-profile cases. Nick's courtroom behavior became a lens through which broader societal issues, mental health awareness, the handling of emotionally disturbed defendants, and the pressures of family and fame, were debated and examined. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this chaos was the tension it created for the jury. Jurors are meant to be impartial, assessing evidence and testimony objectively. Yet when faced with a defendant who is visibly agitated, defiant, and unpredictable, even the most disciplined jurors can be influenced by perception, emotion, and instinct. The courtroom outbursts, therefore, were not just dramatic. They were pivotal, shaping the narrative and potentially influencing the ultimate outcome of the trial. As the hearing concluded, court officers escorted Nick from the room, his agitation simmering but temporarily contained. The footage of the courtroom, replayed endlessly in news cycles, cemented the public's perception of a man both troubled and dangerous. Analysts debated whether his behavior would continue, intensify, or become more controlled as legal proceedings advanced. Every prediction was speculative, yet the uncertainty itself fueled fascination and fear. The courtroom chaos also left an indelible impression on the public consciousness. Nick Reiner, already infamous for the allegations against him, had now added a visual and emotional layer to the story. A son in shackles, visibly distressed, struggling to maintain control under the scrutiny of a nation. It was a powerful reminder that legal proceedings are not abstract. They are human, unpredictable, and, in this case, deeply unsettling. As the nation grappled with images of courtroom chaos, one question loomed larger than any other. What had pushed Nick Reiner to this point? Was his behavior in court a reflection of the same psychological pressures that led to the murders, or was it a response to the overwhelming reality of facing the consequences of his actions? The answers remained elusive, and the tension was far from over. The moment the charges were officially announced, the trajectory of Nick Reiner's life and the lives of everyone connected to the tragedy shifted irreversibly. The Los Angeles County District Attorney, Nathan Hochman, outlined a list of allegations that left little room for doubt. 2 counts of first-degree murder, special circumstances of multiple murders, and an allegation that a deadly weapon, a knife, was personally used. The words themselves were chilling, formal yet loaded with implications, signaling not just the severity of the alleged crimes, but also the high stakes facing Nick Reiner. First-degree murder in California carries the possibility of life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. The inclusion of special circumstances magnifies the severity, sending a clear message that the prosecution intended to pursue the maximum possible consequences. From the moment these charges were filed, the courtroom transformed into a stage for a legal battle that would dominate headlines, social media feeds, and public discourse for months, if not years. For Nick's defense team, led by attorney Alan Jackson, the first task was daunting: to navigate a case that was already loaded with public emotion, celebrity scrutiny, and overwhelming media coverage. Jackson faced not only the legal challenge of defending a man accused of murdering his parents, but also the public relations challenge of shaping a narrative that could mitigate bias and maintain focus on the legal facts. Jackson's immediate public statements emphasized caution and the need for a fair trial, warning against snap judgments based on the defendant's behavior in court or media coverage. He painted a portrait of a man struggling with mental health issues, urging the public to recognize the complexities of the case before leaping to conclusions. Prosecutors, by contrast, framed the charges as a response to the egregious nature of the crime. They emphasized the premeditated aspects of the murders, the use of a deadly weapon, and the special circumstance of multiple murders as indicators that the acts were deliberate and horrific. Hochman and his team presented a meticulous account of the evidence gathered, from forensic findings to witness statements and digital records, building a narrative that sought to establish both motive and intent. The tension between the defense and prosecution set the tone for what would become a protracted, high-profile trial. The legal implications of the charges were staggering. Should Nick Reiner be convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, he could face the death penalty, a sentence that carries both moral and procedural weight. California, despite its moratorium on executions, still imposes the legal framework for capital punishment, meaning that Nick could spend the rest of his life on death row or face life imprisonment without parole. The gravity of these potential outcomes added an immense layer of pressure to every court appearance, every motion filed, and every strategic decision made by the defense and prosecution alike. Mental health considerations also became central to the legal strategy. Nick's courtroom outbursts, his suicide prevention smock, and his erratic behavior provided the defense with a pathway to argue diminished capacity, impaired judgment, or temporary insanity. Psychologists and legal experts debated whether his mental state could mitigate the charges or reduce the likelihood of the death penalty being imposed. In high-profile criminal cases, mental health is often a double-edged sword. It can elicit sympathy and understanding, yet it can also raise doubts about the defendant's credibility or stability. In the weeks following the filing of charges, pretrial motions, hearings, and legal strategizing dominated the court calendar. Defense attorneys filed motions challenging aspects of evidence collection, jury selection procedures, and the admissibility of certain witness statements. Prosecutors responded with counter-motions, arguing the necessity of including all pertinent evidence and emphasizing the seriousness of the alleged crimes. Each legal maneuver was critical, laying the groundwork for what could become a trial lasting months, if not years. The media coverage of these legal proceedings was relentless. National news networks, local stations, and online platforms reported every motion, statement, and development with intense scrutiny. Social media users dissected transcripts, debated legal tactics, and speculated about potential outcomes. This coverage created a feedback loop. Every news story fueled public interest, which in turn amplified media reporting, keeping Nick Reiner and his legal battle in the spotlight. Analysts noted that in cases involving celebrity families, the court of public opinion can be nearly as influential as the legal system itself, shaping perceptions and sometimes indirectly influencing jury selection and trial strategy. Jury selection itself became a complex, highly scrutinized process. Given the extensive media coverage, ensuring impartiality was a challenge. Lawyers on both sides meticulously